The sky stretched above the National Mall, an unbroken canvas of piercing blue. The air was crisp, charged with the electric anticipation of history in the making. Below, the vast expanse of the crowd stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the grand podium where Donald Trump delivered his inaugural address. Cameras flashed, supporters cheered, and somewhere, distant but undeniable, the steady thrum of protest beat against the celebration like a war drum. But amidst the spectacle, beneath the towering banners, beyond the sea of faces, another story was unfolding, a quieter one, a story no one saw coming. Behind his father, Barron Trump stood tall and composed, the ever-watchful observer, a shadow within the stage of a political dynasty. He had always been there, silent, reserved, content to let history move around him. But today, something was different. There was a tension in his stance, a sharpness in his gaze. Then, it happened. A ripple in the crowd, subtle at first, a disturbance rolling outward like a gathering storm. From the left flank, a voice rose, jagged and cutting. "Your America is dead!" The words, laced with mockery, sliced through the air, forcing an unnatural hush over the surrounding spectators. All eyes turned. A young activist, his face contorted in derision, pointed a careless, contemptuous finger at an elderly veteran clad in a faded MAGA hat. "Your values are outdated," he sneered. "Nobody needs them anymore." The words hung, venomous and cruel. The veteran, frail but dignified, gripped his cane, his hands trembling from age, or perhaps something else entirely. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came. How could they? How could a lifetime of sacrifice, of battles fought, of friends lost, of blood spilled on distant soil, be reduced to nothing in a single breath? Laughter. A sharp, reckless sound erupted from the activist's friends, feeding off his audacity. Their amusement swelled, oblivious, unchecked. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the laughter stopped, because Barron Trump was moving. The shift was subtle at first, a simple step forward, but somehow it was enough to silence the air itself. With the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his life under the scrutiny of cameras, Barron descended the podium steps. His tall frame cut a commanding figure against the marble backdrop, his movement deliberate, unhurried. Donald Trump, mid-sentence, paused. The audience stilled. The activist's smirk faltered, his bravado flickering like a candle in the wind as Barron stepped toward the microphone. And then, the youngest Trump spoke. "I wasn't planning on speaking today." His voice rang out, steady, measured, but carrying the weight of something undeniable. A stillness settled over the crowd. "But what I just witnessed," Barron continued, his words slicing through the silence, "isn't the America my father talks about. And it's certainly not the America that man over there nearly died protecting." A collective inhale rippled through the audience. The veteran's watery eyes lifted, locking onto Barron's gaze. And then, Barron turned. His stare found the activist. Blue eyes like steel, cold, unflinching, unmoved by the weight of expectation, unafraid of the moment he had just claimed. And at that second, before a single word more was spoken, the entire world listened. Barron let the silence settle, let the moment stretch just long enough for the weight of his words to sink in. Then his voice, stronger now, steadier, rose above the hush. "You know what I see when I look at that hat?" His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't pleading. It was certain. The kind of certainty that couldn't be ignored. "I see a man who stormed beaches under Nazi fire while people your age died beside him. I see someone who spent 40 years in a factory, his hands worn and scarred, building the America you now take for granted." Barron took a step forward. Not rushing, not posturing, just moving, with the quiet, unshakable force of someone who knew he had the floor and knew he had earned it. "And you call him outdated?" His gaze never wavered. "You mock his values?" The activist swallowed hard. The audience leaned in. And Barron was just getting started. You want to know what's really outdated? He asked, his voice smooth but edged like a blade. Thinking you can build a future by disrespecting the people who gave you everything you have. A beat of silence. That's not progress. His next words landed like a hammer. That's just ingratitude. Something shifted. The veteran, who had moments ago seemed so fragile, so small against the cruel weight of history, lifted his chin. His grip on his cane no longer trembled. The steel in his spine, long buried beneath time and sacrifice, straightened. Across the crowd, other elderly supporters nodded in silent agreement, some blinking rapidly, others discreetly wiping away tears. Donald Trump, watching from the podium, was still. For the first time in a long time, a flicker of something unreadable, something close to surprise crossed his face. But Barron didn't pause. My father taught me something important, he continued, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. He told me that America isn't just a place, it isn't just a government. He let his gaze sweep across the crowd. It's a promise. A murmur rippled through the audience. A promise passed down through generations, Barron said, his tone unwavering. A promise that if you work hard, if you respect others, if you love your country, you can build something that lasts. His words carried, not just through the speakers, but through the people. The activist shifted uncomfortably. The arrogance, the smugness that had fueled him moments ago, had long since drained from his face. But Barron wasn't finished. He exhaled slowly, as if choosing his next words carefully. And then, but here's what really bothers me, he said, his voice carrying an edge of something deeper now, something close to disgust. People my age think they're so enlightened. His blue eyes burned cold, locked onto the young man before him. They mock tradition. A pause. They laugh at faith. Another. They call patriotism outdated. The activist's friends who had been so bold before, laughing, sneering, jeering, stood frozen now, their phones forgotten in their hands. And yet, Barron continued, his voice rising, his words cutting through the crisp winter air like steel. They're the first to enjoy the freedoms that better men than them died for. The murmur from the crowd grew. This wasn't just another speech. This was something else, something raw, something real. Barron's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. You think their values are outdated? His voice lifted, not in anger, but in conviction. Family, hard work, patriotism, faith, respect. His eyes bore into the activist. Tell me, what exactly are you offering instead? The words hung, weighted, unshakable. Division? Barron pressed. Cancel culture. A world where disagreement means destruction? And suddenly, the activist had nothing to say. His mouth parted, but no sound came. The laughter that had once echoed through the crowd was gone. Now there was only silence. A silence so thick, so absolute, it was almost deafening. And for the first time, perhaps in his entire life, Barron Trump owned the moment. Barron took a breath, measured, steady, unshaken. The weight of the moment pressed in, the eyes of the nation fixed on him, waiting. I've been quiet for years, he said, his voice calm but carrying through the vast expanse of the National Mall. Watching. Learning. His gaze swept across the sea of faces, lingering on the young activist who now stood motionless, stripped of his earlier bravado. And you know what I've learned? Barron continued, his tone sharper now, cutting through the tension like steel through glass. The people who shout the loudest about progress often understand the least about what makes a nation great. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The veteran who had been mocked, who had moments ago stood small beneath the weight of ridicule, now stood taller, his eyes shimmering with something new. Pride. Barron let the silence settle, let it breathe. Then he spoke again, softer now, but no less powerful. This isn't about old versus young. A pause. It's not about left versus right. Another. It's about remembering who we are. And then, he said something no one was prepared for. I want to make a promise, Barron declared, not just to the people before him, not just to the ones who had cheered, but to every American who still believed in what had made this country great. I promise you this. A tremor of anticipation ran through the crowd. Even Donald Trump, who had spent decades commanding rooms, defining moments, looked stunned. And then, when I become president, Barron said, not if, when. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The camera zoomed in, capturing the sheer intensity of his conviction, the unwavering force behind those words. I won't just protect our borders and economy, he continued. I'll protect the soul of America. The words echoed through the cold January air, hanging there, undeniable. The veteran swallowed hard, his knuckles whitening around his cane. Barron's voice carried on, unwavering, every word weighted with purpose. I'll protect the factory worker who still believes in the American dream, the teacher who still wants to pray with her students, the farmer who works his land with pride, the small business owner who built everything from nothing. Then he turned back to the activist. And yes, he said, his expression unreadable, I'll even protect your right to mock what you don't understand. The young man stiffened. Barron's next words struck like a hammer. Because that's what America does. A beat of silence. We protect everyone's rights, even when they use those rights to disrespect everything we hold dear. The roar that followed was deafening. But Barron wasn't finished. The cheers still shook the air, but he cut through them like a blade. But understand this, he continued, his voice slicing through the applause. The America you take for granted? A hush fell. It wasn't built by mockers and critics. His next words fell like thunder. It was built by the very people you're laughing at today. A silence heavier than stone settled over the gathering. The activist looked down at his feet. His friends who had stood so boldly beside him only moments ago exchanged uneasy glances. Barron exhaled. His next words, his final words, were steady, deliberate. And I stand here today, at 17 years old, to tell you something that might shock you. He took one final step toward the edge of the podium, his presence now undeniable. These values, he let the moment breathe, let the anticipation build. They're not dying. A pause. They're not fading away. And then, they're about to make the biggest comeback in American history. The roar that erupted shook the very foundation of Washington, D.C., and for the first time, Barron Trump wasn't just the quiet son of a president, he was something more. He was the future. This wasn't just a speech, it was a defining moment, a declaration, a promise. Do you believe America's values are making a comeback? What part of Barron's speech resonated with you the most? Let's talk in the comments. If you stand for strength, tradition, and the unwavering spirit of America, hit subscribe now. Don't miss more powerful stories that capture the fight for the soul of a nation.